The Baltimore Orioles are reportedly looking at every possible angle to bring in some major league starting pitching this offseason. But could it be via trade? And could it be for a player as good as Corbin Burnes? We'll talk about that coming up on today's episode. Plus, talk about some incredible Orioles art as we talk with an artist in Daniel Horine and talk about where you can get his great piece about Eddie Murray. That's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, November 29th, 2022, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to take a look at the potential trade candidates for the Orioles. If they're going to target starting pitching via trade, well, there's a couple of names out there, and four names specifically that Ken Rosenthal mentioned in his column on The Athletic on Monday. Corbin Burnes, Pablo López, Tarik Skubal, and Zach Plesac. Could the Orioles pick up any of those four to help their rotation via trade this offseason? We'll get to that. Plus, coming up at the end of the show, got a great guest coming on. It is Daniel Horine. He is the artist in charge of the Popfly Pop Shop, which every week has a new piece of baseball and comic book inspired art that he sells on his site. Some amazing pieces. And this week, the piece centers around Orioles legend Eddie Murray. We'll talk to Daniel about the history of his shop, what made him want to do a piece on Eddie Murray, his collaboration with Eddie, and where you could get the piece for yourself, especially in a giveaway here on the Locked On Orioles podcast as well. But that's all coming up on this episode of the pod. Before we get there, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms, and we're still going 5 days a week for about 3 more weeks here. We'll be Monday through Friday throughout the offseason, and then we get to about December 19th. We will just trim it down to about 3 days a week, but we'll still go Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Have all the Orioles offseason news for you right here. And hey, the hot stove did heat up just a tad on Monday. Now, the Orioles didn't make any moves, but as of recording here, right around 8 p.m. Eastern time on Monday night, we saw the Astros sign Jose Abreu. We saw the Reds sign Luke Maile. We saw the Mariners sign Trevor Gott. And while some of those guys aren't the biggest stars, that's 3 big leaguers, 3 major league players signing major league deals with 3 different teams. And as always, the week after Thanksgiving, things start to churn. Then we get to the winter meetings next week, and hopefully the moves start to be made. We'll have it all covered here on the Locked On Orioles podcast. And you're certainly going to want to be subscribed to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, because we're going to have a giveaway coming up right here on the end part of this episode. But first, we got to talk Orioles trades, because as we've previewed this offseason, talk about what the Orioles could do specifically to add starting pitching, I feel like I've exhausted every option as free agents. I've gone through pretty much every free agent starting pitcher. I've mentioned them all, I think, at least once on the pod since the offseason started, just trying to sort through who the Orioles could be targeting, who they could sign, because I think everyone's in agreement. The Orioles are going to sign bare minimum at least one starting pitcher this offseason. But I think a lot of people think they could supplement that by trading for a starting pitcher as well, because we don't know what the Orioles payroll will be, how much it will increase, how much money Mike Elias and his staff will have to spend this offseason. But what we do know is that the Orioles have a top 5 farm system in all of baseball. They have a lot of hitting talent in the minors that they can trade from to get, maybe some cheaper arms who are still just as talented as those guys on the free agent market. And Ken Rosenthal today, of course, one of the best baseball reporters out there, writing in his usual Monday column for The Athletic, wrote about the Orioles. It was the first time in a while he had mentioned the Orioles in the column. And that's huge, because something I've talked about here this offseason is that, yeah, I want the Orioles to make moves, but at the very least early in the offseason, maybe before they've made their moves, at the very least, I would like the O's to be mentioned in the Ken Rosenthal column, to be mentioned when it comes to rumors on players. Just have the name come up. And so here is what Ken Rosenthal wrote at the very end of his notes column on Monday. Quote, the Orioles are dabbling in the market for free agent starting pitchers and also cannot be ruled out on a trade for any starter who might be available. From the Brewers' Corbin Burnes and Marlins' Pablo López to the Guardians' Zach Plesac and Tigers' Tarik Skubal. He goes on to talk about how the Orioles have one of the best systems in baseball and have a lot of young hitters in the minors who they could trade away, mentioning guys like Colton Cowser, Jordan Westburg, and Kobe Mayo. They could be trade candidates to go and get a starting pitcher. But I wanted to specifically key in on those four names: Burnes, Lopez, Skubal, and Plesac. Look at their chances to come to the Orioles and what they would bring to the O's. And let's start with Corbin Burnes, because obviously by far out of those four names, Corbin Burnes is locked down the best pitcher. He goes to any team in baseball right now, Corbin Burnes is pretty much their ace. He is a legitimate ace in the majors right now. The right-hander is only 28. He's a free agent after 2024, so you get at least 2 seasons out of him. And for how good he is, I mean, the MLB trade rumors estimate an arbitration for him is that you would only pay him about $11.4 million for the 2023 season. Now you'd end up paying him more, somewhere around 15, 16, 17 million probably for 2024, but that's still worth it because he is an ace. That's still cheap for an ace. Buying an ace on the market, you're looking at $30+ million a year. Corbin Burnes is going to cost 11 next year. That's worth it. But the Brewers, for some reason, are breaking it down a little bit. You know, they just traded Hunter Renfroe to the Angels the other day. There's been talks that they're shopping guys like Colton Wong, maybe Christian Yelich, and Brandon Woodruff and Corbin Burnes, their 1 and 2 starting pitchers, have come up in the trade talks as well. So if Burnes is available, the Orioles should be all over it because you don't just get 1, you get 2 cheap years of him. And then you have him in-house. If you really expand payroll, you could extend him after the 2024 season. But what he would bring to the O's is a legitimate ace. Again, he was the 2021 National League Cy Young Award winner when he just had an unbelievable season. 167 innings, yeah, but he had a 2.43 ERA and a 1.63 FIP in 2021. Listen, he wasn't as good in 2022, but you could argue in some ways he maybe was or a little bit better. He only threw 167 innings in 2021. And there was questions about his durability. You know, would he only go 6 innings every start and then come out? Burnes, while his ERA went up a bit this year, threw 202 innings, which was something I think people never thought Corbin Burnes would be able to do, throw over 200 innings. But he started every 5 days, 33 starts, 202 innings, still had a 2.94 ERA with a 3.14 FIP. He was still dominant. Yeah, the strikeouts went down a bit from 12.6 to 10.8 Ks per 9. Walks went up a little from 1.8 to 2.3 walks per 9, but he was still a dominant ace starting pitcher. And are those extra, 50 or 60 innings even more valuable, even though the production was a little bit lower? You could argue that they were, and I would say it maybe kind of evens out how good Burnes was. Now, he was so good in 21. I think that season's still better, but 22 is closer than you think because of how many incredible innings that he threw. And he's got the stuff to continue to be the ace. I mean, he throws that cut fastball, which he added in 2020, which made him just incredibly dominant. That cutter, in terms of run value via StatCast, is the 8th best pitch in all of Major League Baseball. That's how good that thing is. It's number 1 pitch. Then he's got the curveball, the changeup, the slider. He's really a 6-pitch pitcher, really, at the end of the day. And his curveball, change, and slider, they all have over a 46% whiff rate. All 3 of those pitches are swung and missed at almost 50% of the time. That's absurd. That's how good his stuff is. Plus, opponents only hit 127 against his curveball last year. That was his 2nd most used pitch behind his cutter, and it was basically unhittable. I mean, this guy is a legit ace. And if the Orioles can get him, they should get him. Now, the issue is with Burnes, obviously, you got to give up a lot to go get Corbin Burnes. It's not just a 1-year guy. You get him for 2 years, which makes him even more expensive when you put on top of the fact that he's an ace and a Cy Young contender every single year, and that he's only 28. He's still very, very young and pretty cheap at $11 million. He's going to cost a lot if the Brewers are going to trade him, because even if they may be going into a rebuild, they don't have to trade him now. They could trade him at the deadline. Heck, they could trade him next offseason if they wanted to. So they're not up against the clock. It's not like he's becoming a free agent here in a couple months and they got to deal him now. So the O's would have to give up a lot. It would probably be a package that would include 1 or 2 big leaguers. I would have to think at least one of Anthony Santander or Cedric Mullins would almost be 100% likely that they would be included in that deal because the Brewers lack hitting and especially lack hitting in the outfield. And I think would love to have Mullins or Santander, but the Brewers are looking more past that because Santander and Mullins, they're free agents over the next few years. I think Colton Cowser, the Brewers, it might be the first guy they ask for, is an outfielder who's in AAA, who's young, who's got all the hitting tools, O's former first-round pick. I think that's the first guy they put on the table. Now, it's not just going to be Colton Cowser. It would take more. But you'd look at from the group of Colton Cowser and Jordan Westberg and Joey Ortiz and maybe even Kyle Stowers, Connor Norby, a few of those guys, 2 or 3 at least of those guys would be included in that package. Plus, again, probably a major leaguer. Maybe you're looking at a Mullins, Cowser, Westberg +1 package for Corbin Burnes. Would you do that? You would think about it for how good Corbin Burnes is. Is that overpaying for him? I don't think so. He's a legit Cy Young contender. So it'll be interesting to see what that package would look like. But again, it would be a lot that the Orioles would have to give up, but I'd be willing to do it for Corbin Burnes because he is legit and would make this team look a whole lot different heading into next year. But there's another guy who we've talked about a lot. The next guy is Pablo López. And I'm not going to spend as much time on him because we've talked about Pablo López a lot this offseason. Seems to be, the number one guy whenever it comes up. Well, would the Orioles trade for a starting pitcher? Well, Pablo López of the Marlins is the first name that comes up. 26-year-old righty, just like Burnes, will be a free agent after the 2024 season. So you got 2 years of him. He'll be much cheaper over that time, though. MLB Trade Rumors projects him to make only $5.6 million in arbitration next year. That's basically half of what Burnes would make. And then you'd expect him to make, 10 to 12 million in 2024. He started 32 games, was completely healthy in 2022, 180 innings, a 3.75 ERA, about 9 strikeouts and 2.5 walks per 9. Kind of a similar year in 2021, less innings, only 102, had some injury issues. The ERA was better. The strikeout numbers were better, but again, wasn't as durable. He's got that great changeup that he throws. It would take a lot less to get Pablo López. He's just not the pitcher Corbin Burnes is. I still think he could be an ace for a team, but he hasn't shown that quite yet. And we've seen even MLB.com wrote an article the other day doing 7 trades that could help a bunch of teams. And they proposed a direct swap, 1-for-1, Cedric Mullins for Pablo López. I don't want to trade Cedric Mullins. I think he's very important to the Orioles, and I love Cedric Mullins. That's a trade I would strongly consider if I was the Orioles. Because if you really believe Colton Cowser can help you in 2023, does Pablo López help the Orioles over the next few years more than Cedric Mullins? Maybe. So it's something I would consider, but it's definitely a guy the Orioles are talking about and a team they're talking to in the Marlins. But a couple more pitchers that Rosenthal mentioned in his article that we'll get to coming up in just a second. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by betonline.net, which is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis this season. You can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from college and the NFL and football, college basketball. You've got, of course, the NBA, the NHL, and the World Cup still going on with the huge U.S. match against Iran today. Get all the lines and the odds at betonline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, I hope you do. If you listen to this one, you can find those at BetOnline as well. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more at BetOnline, where the game starts. So we're talking about the 4 starting pitchers who Ken Rosenthal wrote about in his piece in The Athletic on Monday, talking about the Orioles, are looking at all the free agent starting pitchers and also looking at the trade market for starters. And he mentioned Corbin Burnes and Pablo López, who I already talked about. And the next guy he mentioned was Tarik Skubal. Now, if you remember back at the trade deadline this year when the Tigers were completely falling apart and Tarik Skubal was pitching like an ace, Skubal's name came up as a potential trade candidate. It really shocked some people because, again, Skubal, the lefty, only 26. He's not a free agent until after 2026. He has 4 more years of team control. He's not even arbitration eligible until next offseason, so he's crazy cheap. And people they could not figure out why the Tigers would even possibly be shopping him. And I get they were having a disappointing year, but they're still in somewhat of an upward trajectory. And I agreed with those people. Why in the world would the Tigers trade Tarik Skubal at this point? But it seems like that name is still somewhat out there. And again, if the O's can get him, get him. Now, Skubal is coming off an injury, so it's probably less likely that the Tigers trade him now. They're going to get less value for him when he's been injured. Had flexor tendon surgery in his throwing arm on August 17th. Took him out for the rest of the season. We still don't have a great timeline on him, but being ready for opening day is certainly in jeopardy. That's not a foregone conclusion at all that he'll be back in April, but it's not something that's going to take him out for, a giant chunk of the 2023 season. It's seemingly somewhere in the middle in terms of his return. But in the 21 starts he made before the injury, about 118 innings, a 3.52 ERA, a 2.96 FIP, about 9 strikeouts and 2.5 walks per 9. After, a weird 2021 season where he threw 150 innings, he had a 4.34 ERA, but he had 10 Ks per 9, and he was kind of unlucky at times. He's got that great slider that he throws more than any other pitch. And I think he's got ace potential. Again, he's 26. He's still getting better. The injury worries me a little bit because he's had injury troubles, elbow troubles in the past. There was concern that he was going to have to get Tommy John surgery again. Didn't end up being the case. Still got that flexor tendon surgery again in mid-August, so you don't really know where his health is at right now. But he's got to be somebody the O's are looking at. Now, I think he would take close to a Corbin Burnes type haul to get him. Now, he's not the pitcher that Burnes is, and with the injury, makes him less valuable. But instead of 2 years of Burnes, you're getting 4 years of Skubal, who's put up good numbers when he was on the mound last year. He's not even arbitration eligible yet, so you're not even paying him $1 million in 2023. So he's really cheap, which makes him more valuable to teams and makes him more expensive. Might not take the full Burnes haul, but something close. I think the O's stay away here because I don't think the Tigers are going to be, super invested in moving him because of the injury. And I don't know if the O's want to give up the whole farm because of the injury. But if he comes back, he pitches well, and maybe next offseason he's a trade piece, that's where I could see the Orioles going into the Skubal sweepstakes. And the last guy that Ken Rosenthal mentioned is Zach Plesac, the 27-year-old right-hander from the Cleveland Guardians. He still has 3 years under contract. He's a free agent after 2025. He's arbitration eligible for the first time this offseason, and MLB Trade Rumors projects him to make about $2.9 million in 2023, so very cheap for a major league starting pitcher. I'm just not interested in Plesac at all for multiple reasons. For one, on the field, he doesn't measure up to any of these other three guys. Made 24 starts this year for the Guardians, 132 innings, a 4.31 ERA, under 7 strikeouts per 9, and about 2.5 walks per 9. It's not great stuff. It's basically the exact same numbers he had, about 143 innings in 2021, same thing. Mid-4s ERA, about 6 Ks, 2 walks per 9. Doesn't excite me at all. And then when you look at how he got injured this year, again, he only made 24 starts because he got injured, because he was so mad about giving up a homer that he crouched down and he punched the mound and he broke his hand and missed about 6 weeks, actually 2 months really. I don't know about that. Then when you add that to the fact that in 2020, if you remember this story with Cleveland, he went out and broke COVID protocols, and it was a big thing in Cleveland, obviously because of, Terry Francona and his health issues and being immunocompromised and being the manager in that clubhouse. And the whole team kind of turned against him at one point in that 2020 season for breaking those protocols. It was just a messy situation in that Cleveland clubhouse. You add that to breaking your pitching hand because you're frustrated. Plesac was mentioned in the article, and I think he probably will be traded by Cleveland this year just because they have better options and cheaper options for starting pitchers coming up the pipeline. I have no interest in Zach Plesac. Honestly, if we're going after a Guardians, cheaper, lesser starting pitcher, I'd much rather have Aaron Savali, who might also be on the trade block at this point, but I have no interest in Zach Plesac. Well, one thing I do have interest in, as you can see some behind me, and you would see around my apartment as well, is some baseball art, specifically some Orioles art. And we're going to talk to a baseball artist coming up here next, who's got an amazing Eddie Murray Orioles piece, only available this week on the Pop Fly Pop Shop. We're going to talk to Daniel Horine, the artist at the Pop Fly Pop Shop, who makes these incredible baseball prints that are designed as if they are comic book covers, and the players looking like superheroes or sometimes supervillains. But of course, Eddie Murray, who we're going to talk about, is a hero on this cover. Now, you can only get it this week. We'll tell you how you can get it, the history of Daniel's art, and also how you can maybe get a free one or at least win one by subscribing to the Locked On Orioles podcast. But that's all coming up with Daniel Horine of the Pop Fly Pop Shop right after this. All right, and to finish off today's episode, we've got a very special guest joining us. He is Daniel Horine of the Pop Fly Pop Shop, and he's got some exciting Orioles art to tell us about here on today's episode. But Daniel, first of all, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, Jazz. So we wanted to get to some Eddie Murray art that you've got coming out, which is just awesome. I might add, cannot wait to have that hanging among. Got a lot of baseball art on the wall in the apartment and cannot wait to add this one. But I just wanted to start with, I was not super familiar with your work before we connected for this podcast, but just kind of looking through the stuff you've done and the website, I'm surprised I hadn't found this before because this is kind of right up my alley of what is just hanging in my apartment. So I just wanted to kind of get your story on, what took you this way to basically make, baseball stars into essentially comic book heroes and put out some great art.
Thanks. Really, it was just a project started on a whim in a spare bedroom in the start of the pandemic. It was very, very accidental. Just like, oh, I did this piece. Let's put it out and see what happens, and we'll put a timer on and see how that works. And now, gosh, it's been 108 releases later, and 2.5 years, and since then, it turned from a very humble project into spare bedrooms, selling 10, 11, 12 copies, and now it's become me and my wife's full-time job. My work is currently hanging in Cooperstown in the Hall of Fame. I've had the privilege of working with a ton of athletes and Hall of Famers and making these pieces together with them. It took me to Topps, was on Topps Project 100. So it has been a very interesting journey full of things and moments that I could not have planned for if I tried.
If you're watching here on YouTube, you'll get to see the Eddie Murray print in a second that we'll talk about. But just in general, you're talking about working with some of these stars and getting to work directly with your subjects. Who are some of the names? Eddie Murray obviously being an amazing one here in Baltimore, but just in general, some of the names that stand out to you when you look back to when you started this project. Do you ever think like, I can't believe I got to collaborate with this person throughout this journey?
Absolutely. Like I'm still 10 years old inside. When I see these guys, I'm looking at them, even though I'm in my 40s, they're still 10-year-old eyeballs looking at these guys. So to work with Nolan Ryan and Randy Johnson, Wade Boggs, Dale Murphy, Brooks Robinson, these are like Mount Rushmore people, the kind of caliber players of their franchises, and to work with them is just. Yeah, it's I do have to like tamper the little giddy 10-year-old that's really excited to talk to these people and try to meet them eye to eye, but I'm still always a pinch me moment when I get to speak to these guys.
You mentioned the Brooks Robinson piece, which was great. I know there was a Billy Ripken one kind of based off the famous baseball card. And when you come up with the ideas, how does the process work for you? Does it start with, I've got an idea for what a cover would look like, let me insert the player? Or does it start with, I think a player would be great here, and let me insert, what this, faux comic book cover would really look like?
Most of the time it starts with the inspiration of the player, or they might have a nice visually descriptive nickname. I've been wanting to do a Brooks Robinson one forever. The human vacuum cleaner was made for a comic book, and so it just a lot of research is kind of where it starts, and great nicknames certainly help. I don't think I fully answered your question earlier, but about to kind of how this came about, but it really is looking back to my youth, and the two things that I loved the most as a kid was baseball and comic books. And so not an intentional, it wasn't an intentional combination of these two things, at least knowingly that this would be such a great vehicle. But as I got into it, I was just putting a style on a subject I love, baseball. But when I got into it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is perfect, because the comic book visual language is so suited for this long-running soap opera that is professional baseball. You have your heroes, your villains, your evil empires, your underdogs, your outlandish characters, and these unbelievable moments. And so, and the hyperbolic, visual language and literal language of comic books is just made for this kind of storytelling. And so it was just it didn't seem like it would go together, but once I put it together, I'm like, this feels right.
Yeah, for me, one of the reasons I was so excited that we were to connect on this is I'm someone who could be at the ballpark one night to watch the O's, and the very next night I'm in the theater to see the newest Marvel movie when it's coming out. So I felt like, well, this is a perfect combo right here. But we got to get, of course, to the Steady Eddie art, which is out this week. And obviously a classic Oriole in the Hall of Fame, in the Orioles Hall of Fame. His 33 is retired by the O's, one of the greatest players in franchise history and one of the best nicknames in Orioles franchise history as well. When you look at Eddie, he was such a beloved figure. He had 2 different stints with you. I mean, they brought him back. He was almost 40, and they brought him back because Baltimore just loved Eddie so much. But, you combine the mustache, which you see on the art, you combine the nickname. Is that kind of all went into when you thought, you know what, maybe Eddie Murray is my next subject?
Well, for Eddie Murray, see, I started this project back in 2020. I say back in as if it was ages ago, way back in 2020 in June. And by August of that year, two months later after I started it, I had done my first loose sketch of Eddie Murray. I've been wanting to do Eddie Murray for a long time. And I'm in LA right now. I grew up in LA. The Los Angeles Dodgers are where I learned about baseball. And right when I was just in pun intended, full swing of my baseball love as a kid, Eddie Murray was on the Dodgers. And so he's been on my radar since the beginning, and he's been a character that I've gravitated to obviously from the beginning. And cool thing was I got to meet him over the summertime at Cooperstown. Got to take the field with him and Cal Ripken Jr. and Jim Thome and Ozzie Smith. And I was very intimidated by Eddie Murray because he did not have a great relationship with the press, understandably. He just wanted to show up and play baseball, not talk about it. He was very much about the team. But as a kid, any nuances of a player, I don't know, especially without the internet. I don't know. All I knew was Eddie Murray was scary to me, and he just looked very serious. And so when I got to meet him in Cooperstown, I brought my young son with him, my 6-year-old kid, and there's Eddie Murray. I'm going to take a picture with him. And the sweetest man on the field, hands down, was absolutely 100% Eddie Murray. And he guided my sweet little 6-year-old over. It's like, you stand next to me, and Ozzie helped him down the stairs and posed him. Just couldn't ask for a sweeter gentleman. And I was so pleasantly surprised just by his interactions, and then digging into him and researching him for the piece. You ask any person who played on a team with them, who's the best teammate you ever had? Their answer is always Eddie Murray. And so anyway, so all these elements, growing up with him and then having such a lovely experience with him in Cooperstown, just I couldn't wait to do this piece.
Yeah, and for Orioles fans, such a beloved figure, and to get him back, the special thing for Orioles fans was to get him back, for him to hit his 500th home run in an Orioles uniform at Camden Yards. There's an orange seat for a while in right field in Camden Yards where he hit number 500, and that makes him so special. I'm sure you got to look into, just like you talked about, that he meant a lot to the Orioles, and it's been a little while since the O's have been as good as they were at times when Eddie was on the team. But you look up in the stadium and you see that 33 every time you walk in there, and you can tell he had an impact.
Absolutely. And someone made a really great point. And they commented on the piece, and they were relaying the story of their childhood. I can't remember the teams or where they were, but Eddie Murray was on the opposing team of who they were there to see. And they stood up and the audience just cheered for Eddie Murray, even though he was on the opposing team. He was one of those players that there was so much respect for, regardless of what team you were on. You cheer for Eddie Murray just because he is, he's on the Mount Rushmore of Oriole, not only Oriole players, but just first baseman, ball players in general. He was only the third player in history to get to 500 home runs and 3,000 hits, and the first two were Hank Aaron and Willie Mays. Like he quietly is just one of the greatest ball players there ever was.
Yeah. And, not talked about as much as some other guys in the 500 home run club, but just an incredible career. And I love it at the very top of the design, the two-sided power, because you got to remember as well, one of the greatest switch hitters also ever in baseball history. But we're talking about Eddie, and you're going to get to talk to him, I understand, later this week. And I'll let everybody know where they can see that and see Eddie kind of talk about this piece that really, captures him and his great career.
Yeah. We're going to talk with Eddie on the Popfly YouTube page this Thursday evening at 5:30 Pacific. If that makes it 8:30 Eastern, I think, if I'm doing my math correctly.
Got it.
And what's been important to me about these pieces is getting the players involved to make them happen has been special, so that when you have a piece on your wall, that a player was involved in it in some fashion. And then these interviews that we do with them, we like to do them live to sort of bridge the gap between the player and the fans, and ask some questions live and just kind of take out some of those barriers, and at least bring the fans close to the athlete as we can, be it via that chat or having their creative fingerprints on the piece.
Yeah, and it should be cool to see his thoughts on this as well. But I know everybody at this point, as we're chatting, is clamoring to get their hands on some art here. So just let everybody know where they can find the piece, where they can find the shop in general, and how long they have to go and get themselves one as well.
Thanks. This is available. All my pieces available for 1 week only. It was released last Sunday, and it is retiring next Sunday. I believe it's the actually I don't know, was it the 4th?
December 4th, yeah.
That is December 4th. So it retires 3 p.m. Pacific, December 4th. After that is retired forever. There are 3 options that you can get. You can get a regular one, you can get one signed by Eddie Murray, or you can get one signed with an inscription for the Hall of Fame 2003, Eddie Murray. All 3 options are available on popflypopshop.com from now until Sunday. And when Sunday comes, this piece retires, a new piece will be going up.
And we're Locked On Orioles here. We're going to have a chance for you to get yourself, you're the listener, to get yourself one as well. Make sure you are subscribed to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. And in the comments on today's episode, on this video, give us your favorite Eddie Murray memory, whether you watched him play, or if you're a little too young and didn't get to watch him play, that's okay. Just your favorite stat, your favorite, anything about Eddie Murray and his career with the Orioles, and you will be entered to win one of these amazing prints, the Steady Eddie. It's a great look. It'll look great in anyone's home, and awesome to just kind of remember the career of Eddie Murray. But Daniel, thank you so much. I mean, this is some awesome art that Orioles fans, I'm sure, will want to get their hands on. And obviously, Brooks Robinson, a great subject. Billy Ripken, not the player that those two were, but of course, what the piece was based around, obviously, is great for an art piece as well. And then Eddie right up there as well as one of the all-time greats.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Those are some fantastic players.
But Daniel, thank you so much again for joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So that was Daniel Horine talking about his piece, his Steady Eddie piece. Again, you can go get that at the Popfly Pop Shop. But remember, only up there until Sunday, December 4th. That'll do it for today's episode. We'll be back with you tomorrow. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.